Workers had gathered in the bright dining room for what was supposed to be a normal midday meal. It was lunchtime, the kind of routine break people took without a second thought. Conversations overlapped softly. Plates clinked. Trays slid across tables. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt dangerous. Then, at exactly 12:39 p.m., everything changed. Without warning, the glass wall at the front of the restaurant exploded inward. A blue Ford Ranger pickup truck crashed straight through the windows and into the dining area. The force of the impact sent tables flying and slammed into people who had been sitting just seconds earlier, eating lunch, talking about their day. For a brief moment, the entire room froze. Most people thought it was a terrible accident. A medical emergency failed Brachus. Something awful, but unintentional. People stood up instinctively, some already moving toward the injured, ready to help. That moment of confusion didn't last. Before anyone could fully react, the driver raised a handgun and began firing. The first shots caught everyone completely off guard. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and violent, cutting through the shock. Panic followed instantly. Screams filled the air. People dropped to the floor. Chairs scraped as bodies scrambled for cover. Some hid beneath tables. Others tipped tables over, using them as shields. Within seconds, the restaurant was no longer a place of routine comfort. It had become a scene of terror. What had been an ordinary lunch was turning into a massacre. In just minutes, regular lunchgoers would be transformed into victims who would never return home, or survivors forced to fight for their lives with whatever they could find, protecting themselves and anyone within reach. This was the Luby's Cafeteria in Killeen, Texas, a mid-sized town of about 50,000 people at the time, known mostly for its connection to Fort Hood. A quiet place, a place where something like this felt unimaginable. Yet what was unfolding inside that restaurant would soon become the deadliest mass shooting in American history at that time. A tragedy that would permanently alter how the country thought about public safety and everyday spaces. The violence had struck without warning, inside an ordinary restaurant, on an ordinary afternoon, and the nightmare was only just beginning. The pickup truck came to a sudden stop near the cash registers, jolting violently as it bounced back on its shock absorber. The abruptness of the halt caught people's attention immediately. Among them was 32-year-old Dr. Susana Gracia, who had arrived at the cafeteria with her parents, Al and Ursula Gracia. Earlier that day, Susana had planned to skip lunch. Her chiropractic clinic had been packed with patients, and she almost said no when a friend who managed the restaurant invited her to stop by. At the last moment, she agreed. Now, standing near the front of the dining room, she stared at the truck, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. That's when she noticed something chilling. The truck had crashed directly into the spot where she and her parents usually sat. The only reason they weren't there that day was because someone else had already taken the table. Around her, people were screaming. Others groaned in pain. Still, most assumed the crash had been accidental. Instinctively, people rushed forward to help those who had been struck or thrown by the impact. A group of Killeen Independent School District employees had been gathered nearby, celebrating Boss's Day. They had just finished lunch and were giving their supervisor gifts when the truck tore through the wall. At first, they thought the driver had lost control. It seemed embarrassing, not dangerous. They stood watching, waiting to see what he would do next. Near the shattered windows, an elderly couple, 75-year-old James and Lula Welsh, lay on the floor. They had been hit during the truck's violent entry. Pastor Kirby Lack and his friend, Dr. Michael Griffith, rushed toward them, trying to offer comfort. Susana also moved closer to the truck. So did a 33-year-old Walmart employee named Thomas Simmons. Thomas had managed to avoid being hit, and now approached the driver as his side window, which was already rolled down. He reached for the door handle, intending to help. Instead, the driver raised a 9mm handgun and fired. Thomas dropped to his knees, covering his face. Before anyone could react, the driver shot him 3 more times. Thomas collapsed onto his back, motionless. For some inside the restaurant, the sound of gunfire still didn't register immediately. They weren't familiar with guns. It took someone shouting for everyone to hit the floor for the reality to finally sink in. The restaurant fell into chaos. People dove beneath tables. Others overturned furniture for cover. The silence of confusion was gone, replaced by terror. This was no accident. As panic spread through the cafeteria, the driver remained seated behind the wheel of the truck, scanning the room. His eyes locked onto another Walmart employee, Luis Caraballo, who had come to lunch with Thomas Simmons. Luis had been struck by the truck during the crash, and now lay injured nearby. Without hesitation, the driver leaned out of the window and fired at him. Even after being hit by both a vehicle and a bullet, Luis survived, though. At that moment, no one could have known that. The gunman shifted his aim again, this time toward the west wall of the restaurant. Dee Leisure and Glenn Spivey were sitting there when a bullet grazed Dee's cheek. The shock of the impact barely registered before instinct took over. The two scrambled away, racing toward a narrow walkway that led to the kitchen. As more shots rang out, they dropped to the floor. Glenn positioned himself over Dee, shielding her with his body. By now, the driver had climbed out of the truck. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean, and unsettlingly calm. His face, once described as handsome, was twisted with rage. As he moved through the cafeteria, he fired at close range, shouting accusations and bitter phrases about women, about betrayal, about revenge. His words made it clear this wasn't random. This wasn't confusion. This was deliberate. Pastor Kirby Lack dove beneath the table alongside Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Charles Doody, a Vietnam War veteran stationed at Fort Hood, and 29-year-old John Romero Jr. Doty was only 2 weeks away from retirement. None of that mattered now. Nearby, the gunman turned toward a group of school district employees. He shot James Swift in the foot. At the same table, Counselor Susan Hester squeezed her eyes shut and began silently praying. Mari Roberts, seated beside her, kept her eyes open, terrified that closing them would mean death. All three survived. The gunman moved again. He shot Algika Taylor in the leg. Algika was there with her daughter, Anaka McNeil, and her 3-year-old granddaughter, Liksha. The wound left Algika unable to move, but still alive. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the gunman had passed him by, but that moment would not last. Etornet. Hawaii, moving deeper into the restaurant, toward the large planter in the center of the room as fear tightened its grip on everyone still breathing. The large planter sat near the center of the dining room, formed by 4 wooden lattice walls, arranged like a cross. To anyone eating lunch that day, it was just another piece of deck. In that moment, it became a place of profound sorrow. Just northwest of the planter, the Henahan family was seated together. Bernard and Venice Henahan had traveled from Missouri to Texas to attend their granddaughter's upcoming wedding. They were joined by their daughter Judy, her husband Stephen Ernst, and 2 close family friends. It was supposed to be a happy trip, a brief stop for lunch before continuing on. The intruder approached the planter and acted through a narrow gap in the lattice. The first impact reached Stephen Ernst. He gasped, instinctively clutching his side as the reality of the situation took hold. A second moment of chaos followed almost immediately. It reached Judy, and then her mother, Venice. Venice Henahan fell still instantly. At the table, Bernard and the others were frozen, unable to move, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The sounds around them blurred into chaos, loud echoes, screams, and the crash of dishes hitting the floor. Not far away, Barbara Knight and Kitty Davis were still hiding beneath their table. Moments earlier, they had been sipping coffee. Kitty had been proudly showing photos of her newborn grandchild. Now, they were pressed flat against the floor. The intruder spotted them. A sharp impact struck Barbara's ankle. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She stayed perfectly still, staring at the floor, refusing to flinch. From where she lay, all she could see was the figures, legs and shoes moving through the room. A few feet Hawaii, James Glatt and his pregnant wife Celia lay side by side beneath another table. James tracked the movement, waiting, watching, considering whether there might be a moment to act. Celia whispered urgently, begging him to stay still. As the figure focused on another corner, Celia began reciting the Lord's Prayer out loud, her voice shaking but steady. James and Celia remained safe. Under another table, Kirby Lack remained crouched beside Stephen Doty and John Romero Jr. When John attempted to shift his position, maybe to escape, Kirby saw him rise slightly onto his knees. That was all it took. De Figure Torned and John Romero Jr. fell backward beneath the table. Kirby Lack and Stephen Doty instinctively pulled closer to him, trying to shield him, trying to offer comfort in any way they could. John's breathing became shallow. He didn't speak. He simply drifted into a deep, final stillness. Intruder moved on. He carried his equipment with him, walking through the cafeteria with an unsettling calmness. Some actions seemed random, others deliberate. People were falling quickly as the light faded from the room. During this chaos, Dr. Michael Griffith was struck by the force of the intrusion. He slid down against the wall, struggling to stay upright, trying to push himself back up. His strength failed him, and Michael collapsed to the floor. Nearby, James and Lula Welsh, the elderly couple who had been struck by the vehicle, were still lying where they had fallen. Moments earlier, Kirby and Michael had tried to comfort them. Now the figure stood over them, and their journey ended there. Under the table, Kirby noticed a pause. The intruder's equipment seemed to click a brief moment of silence. For a split second, Kirby thought this might be his only chance. He rose slightly and grabbed a rolling chair. Then came a sharp sound. Stephen Doty peeked out and shouted a warning, but the intruder was already moving again. The figure turned back toward Kirby's table. Stephen Doty fell instantly, and a moment later, Kirby was also struck. As Kirby collapsed, the intruder shouted with rage and spun away, moving toward another section of the dining room. Tables shattered. Glass exploded. Dishes rained down across the floor. And still, the nightmare continued. Tafiga moved toward the southeast section, his presence felt with every step. Shards of glass scattered across the floor, landing just inches from people hiding beneath overturned furniture. Varvara Knight remained frozen on the ground. Nearby, Kitty Davis was not as lucky. She too fell still under the weight of the chaos. A short distance away, two employees, Deborah Gray and Suzanne Rashad, were crouched beneath the table. They clung to each other, barely breathing, hoping the intruder would pass them by. He didn't. In a matter of seconds, both lives reached their end. Tafiga continued circling, returning to where the school district employees were hiding. Ruth Pugil was directly in his path and fell where she sat. Nancy Stanberry was next. There was no hesitation. All around the restaurant, people whispered prayers. Some cried quietly. Others stayed completely silent, terrified that even a sound might draw attention. Toward the back of the cafeteria, Betty Lou Cooper and her daughter Jolie Raspberry saw an opening. They crawled across the floor and slipped into the restroom, barricading the door with their bodies. Elsa Ware, Juanita Williams, and Sylvia King also fell victim to the tragedy. Sylvia's journey ended beside another person, Jimmy Kerr. In the midst of the chaos, some managed to reach the kitchen exits. 17-year-old Mark Matthews hid inside an industrial machine, barely daring to breathe. Maria Sherna ran into the refrigerator, stacking crates for protection. The restaurant had become a maze of fear, and survival now depended on seconds. As the gunman moved west across the dining room, he spotted Glenn Spivey and Dee Leisure. Moments earlier, Dee had grabbed a gray plastic bin used for dirty dishes and placed it over her head, hoping it might hide her blonde hair. She was terrified that standing out, even slightly, could make her a target. Glenn was lying across her body, shielding her completely. He pressed himself against the floor, doing everything he could to protect her. The gunman fired. Glenn's body went limp instantly. Dee felt the sudden weight shift as his body collapsed onto her. She whispered to him, begging him to hold on, trying to convince herself he was still alive. Slowly, carefully, she inched out from beneath him. When she saw his face, the truth was unavoidable. Glenn had been shot directly in the forehead. He had taken one final breath, and then he was gone. Dee forced herself to keep moving. She looked toward the planter and saw an elderly woman trembling in fear. Desperate for human contact, for any sense that she wasn't alone, Dee crawled toward her. As she moved, the gunman noticed. He fired again. A sharp, searing pain tore through Dee's thigh, but she didn't stop. She reached the woman and held on to her tightly. When the gunman shouted at them, demanding to know if it was worth it, both women screamed back, "No!" their voices shaking as they clung to each other. From her hiding place behind a table, Susanna Gracia Hoop watched. She tried to understand what she was seeing. The gunman hadn't asked for money. This wasn't a robbery. He wasn't searching for a specific person. He was killing indiscriminately. As he moved closer to her area, Panic tightened in her chest until she remembered something. She owned a gun. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Then reality crashed in. At the time, Texas law made it illegal to carry a concealed weapon. Even though she owned a Smith & Wesson .38 revolver, she had left it in her car to comply with the law. She was unarmed. That's when her father, Al Gracia, caught her eye. She could see the decision forming on his face. He believed he had to do something because if he didn't, everyone in that room was going to die. Susanna begged him to stay down. Al didn't listen. Al Gracia stood up. For a moment, it felt as though time slowed. Susanna watched in horror as her 71-year-old father, a World War II veteran, stepped out from cover. He was determined, focused, moving with the belief that doing nothing was no longer an option. Susanna pleaded with him, begging him to stay down. Her voice was desperate, breaking through the chaos around them. But Al didn't stop. He had seen what was happening. He believed that if no one acted, everyone left in that room would be killed. The gunman was about 15 feet away. Al charged. He made it halfway before the gunman turned and fired. The bullet struck Al in the chest. He collapsed to the floor, still breathing when he hit the ground. Susanna saw the wound immediately. She knew, even in that moment of shock, she knew her father wasn't going to survive. But Al's bravery changed the course of what happened next. Instead of continuing toward Susanna's table, the gunman veered left. His attention shifted away, creating a brief, fragile opening for others nearby. Gunfire erupted again near the table of school district employees. A bullet tore through the air so close to Maria Burrows that it stunned her senses. When her vision cleared, she saw that Pat Carney was dead beside her. The gunman moved toward the serving line. Several people lay face down on the floor, completely exposed. Unlike those hiding in the dining area, they had no tables, no furniture, no cover at all. George Osborne covered his wife, Ethel, with his own body. He placed his hand gently over her eyes, trying to shield her from what was happening around them. They held their breath as the gunman drew closer. A single shot rang out. Clouding Humphrey, lying just inches away, was struck and killed instantly. The bullet passed so close to George that he could feel its heat, but both he and Ethel survived. Behind the waiting benches near the serving line, Connie Miller and Roxanne Peters were hiding. Roxanne kept her head down, refusing to look. The gunman noticed them. He sneered, mocking Roxanne for trying to hide. Then he shot Connie in the back of the head. Roxanne felt her friend's body jolt beside her, but she still couldn't bring herself to look. The gunman moved on. Several other people were hiding beneath the benches near the serving line, pressed flat against the floor, barely breathing. The gunman noticed movement and fired beneath one of the benches, striking Reverend Shannon McMullen in the leg. The pain was immediate, but he remained alive. Moments later, the gunman aimed beneath another bench. This time, the bullet struck Zona Min, killing her where she lay. I kept Mobing scanning the floor, stepping over bodies without hesitation. Eventually, he reached Charlene Smith. She was crouched low, bracing herself for what she believed would be the final moment of her life. Nothing happened. The gunman's Ruger P89 had run out of ammunition. Instead of reloading it, he placed the pistol on top of a food tray and left it behind. He continued forward with his remaining weapon. As he turned away from the serving line, his eyes landed on Anaka McNeil. She was clutching her 3-year-old daughter, Lakusha, holding her tightly against her chest. Nearby, Anaka's mother, Alhika Taylor, laid bleeding on the floor. Still alive, but unable to move after being shot in the leg earlier. At first, it seemed as though the gunman had moved on from them. But now, he stood directly in front of them. He looked down at Liksha Small, silent, confused, and then stepped to the side. His voice was cold, flat. "Get that kid out of here. I ain't killing no babies today." Anaka hesitated. She didn't know whether to believe him. She didn't know if moving would get her shot in the back. The fear was paralyzing. Her mother met her eyes and gave her a look of urgency. "Just go." Anaka run. She clutched Lakeshaw and sprinted away, waiting for the sound of a gunshot that never came. She didn't stop until she reached safety outside the restaurant, where others had already fled. Inside, Elgika tried to stand, possibly to follow her daughter and granddaughter. As she struggled to rise, the gunman turned back. He shot her in the face. What had seemed like a moment of mercy became one of the most devastating betrayals of the entire attack. And still, the gunman continued moving through the dining room. Though badly wounded, John Romero Jr. was still alive. He lay on the floor, gripping his blood-soaked shirt, struggling to breathe as the gunman began yet another pass through the dining room. Every breath was shallow. Every second felt borrowed. Nearby, Kirby lay face down on the carpet, doing everything he could not to move. The pain from the gunshot wound in his hip had faded into numbness, replaced by a terrifying weakness as blood loss set in. His only hope was stillness, the belief that if he didn't move, the gunman might pass him by. Kirby remained beside John, listening to the gunman's footsteps, each one closer than the last. The shooter noticed movement. He saw that John Romero Jr. was still breathing. Without hesitation, he fired again, this time directly into John's chest. The shot ended any remaining chance of survival. Then the gunman turned toward Kirby. He bent down and straddled Kirby's back. "Wait one." And he grabbed Kirby's hair and lifted his head from the floor. Kirby closed his eyes. He felt the cold pressure of the gun pressed against the back of his head. In that moment, Kirby whispered a final prayer, fully expecting to die. Then suddenly, a loud noise echoed from across the room. The gunman fired, but his aim jerked at the last second. The bullet tore into the carpet just inches from Kirby's face. When Kirby opened his eyes, he realized he was still alive. The noise that saved him came from the back of the restaurant. Tommy Vaughn had been trying desperately to break open a window to escape. When kicking didn't work, he braced himself and threw his body, or possibly a chair, through the glass. The gunman raised his weapon and turned toward the sound. Tommy didn't look back. He knew if he did, fear would freeze him in place. Instead, he climbed through the broken window, cutting his foot in the process, an injury he didn't even feel at the time. That broken window became an escape route. One by one, others followed, slipping through while the gunman was distracted. Later, Tommy Vaughn would be credited with saving around 20 lives. But inside the restaurant, the danger was far from over. As survivors scrambled through the broken window and scattered outside, emergency phone lines were open. Calls poured into 911 dispatch, one after another, stacking up faster than operators could respond. Voices were frantic. Some were screaming. Others struggled just to explain what was happening. "There's a shooting," caller said. "People are being killed." "We've already got someone on the way," dispatchers replied again and again, as the lines clogged and jammed. Family members trying to reach loved ones couldn't get through. The system was flooded. Inside the restaurant, Susanna Gracia Hupp heard the sound of glass breaking but didn't immediately know what had happened. When she peeked out from behind her table, she saw people escaping through the shattered window while the gunman's attention was elsewhere. She seized the moment. Susanna grabbed her mother, Ursula, and pulled her toward the broken window. They ran. When Susanna reached the outside, the cold realization hit her instantly. Her mother wasn't behind her. Just weeks earlier, her parents had celebrated their 47th wedding anniversary. In that moment, it didn't occur to Susanna that her mother would never leave without her husband. Inside, Ursula Gracia crawled back toward Al. It was Fatting slipping in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow. Ursula didn't run. She knelt beside him, gently cradling his head in her lap, refusing to leave him alone. The gunman noticed them. He ignored the chaos near the broken window, ignored the people escaping, and walked directly toward the elderly couple. At that same moment, a police officer reached the shattered window from outside. There was no need for a suspect description. The officer saw a tall man standing over to defenseless people, pointing a gun. Ursula looked up at the gunman, then lowered her head toward her husband. The gunman fired. Ursula was shot and killed beside Al. The officer flinched but did not return fire. Too many innocent people were still in the line of fire. One wrong move could have taken more lives. Ursula's final act, staying with her husband until the end, confirmed the identity of the gunman and gave others precious seconds to escape. By now, officers were on the scene, but the gunman had no intention of stopping. For those still hiding inside the restaurant, the sound of police arriving brought a fragile sense of hope. One survivor later described seeing officers burst through the shattered window, their movements sudden and forceful. In that moment, she released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and thought, "My angels are here." The gunman noticed them immediately. His attention shifted away from the wounded and toward the officers. For the first time since the attack began, he was no longer the only one armed. Outside, several officers from the Department of Public Safety happened to be nearby, training local police at a neighboring hotel. During a break, they heard the sound of glass shattering, then a gunshot. Moments later, a woman ran toward them, screaming that a man with a gun was killing people inside the cafeteria. The officers sprinted to their vehicles to retrieve their weapons and rushed toward the restaurant. Inside, the gunman panicked. He tried to reload one of his pistols, fumbling as his hands moved too fast for his thoughts. In the confusion, he attempted to feed Ruger ammunition into his Glock. It didn't fit. He cursed under his breath, scrambling to correct his mistake as officers pushed in through the curtains. A shot rang out. One of the responding officers fired and struck the gunman in the arm. Even then, the gunman wasn't fully incapacitated. He returned fire as officers advanced cautiously, exchanging gunfire inside the shattered dining room. Another officer later recalled arriving from an unrelated drug raid nearby. When he heard the call come in, he drove straight to the scene in his unmarked vehicle. From roughly 50 yards away, he fired and hit the gunman, then moved inside to continue the engagement alongside other officers. The exchange was brief, but intense. The gunman was running out of ammunition. Cornered and wounded, he made a final decision. He raised his weapon, aimed at his right temple, and fired one last bullet. The gunman was dead. From the moment the truck crashed through the glass until the final shot was fired, only 12 minutes had passed. 12 minutes that changed countless lives forever. Once officers confirmed the gunman was dead, a voice finally called out that the building was secure. For those still alive inside, the words felt unreal. Slowly, cautiously, people began to move. Some crawled out from beneath tables. Others struggled to their feet, shaking, disoriented, injured. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by cries, gasps, and the sounds of footsteps echoing across shattered glass. First responders flooded into the restaurant, moving quickly from body to body, checking for any sign of life. They knelt beside the wounded, calling out, applying pressure, doing everything they could in the chaos. Outside, news vans began arriving almost immediately. Cameras rolled as the first images of the scene were broadcast across the country. What had just happened inside an ordinary restaurant was now becoming national news. With so many injured, local resources were overwhelmed. The city called in the military for assistance. Doctors from nearby fort who'd rushed to help civilian paramedics, triaging victims and stabilizing survivors wherever they could. Inside the dining room, emergency responders found Barbara Knight and Kitty Davis. Barbara insisted they help Kitty first, knowing her injuries were far worse. Kitty had lost fingers. She was barely conscious. Nearby, John Romero Jr. was still clinging to life when medics reached him. He was rushed toward the front of the restaurant, blood soaking through the bandages as responders worked desperately to save him. They did the same for Algracia after discovering he still had a faint pulse. Doctors and medics fought to save both men. Despite their efforts, neither survived. Outside, Susanna Gracia Hupp was reunited with her siblings. In a broken voice, she explained what had happened. Her father had charged the gunman. Her mother had stayed behind with him. By the end of the day, all 3 children had lost both parents. Inside the restaurant, the scene was devastating. Overturned chairs, shattered glass, tables pushed aside, and the bodies of those who never made it out. Authorities closed the curtains at the front of the restaurant, shielding the devastation from view as they prepared for the long, painful work ahead. Outside the restaurant, confusion and fear spread just as quickly as the news itself. Family members who had heard reports of a shooting rushed toward the scene, many without knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. Across the street, a hotel and sheriff's office were turned into an impromptu command post. People gathered there in shock, waiting in crowded hallways and parking lots, clinging to hope while bracing for the worst. Names were called out. Some were reunited. Others received news that would change their lives forever. Local hospitals were overwhelmed. Killeen was a mid-sized town of about 50,000 residents, best known for being home to Fort Hood military base. Even with that nearby resource, The number of wounded pushed the system to its limits. Luby's Cafeteria stepped in quickly. The company rented out 50 local hotel rooms and made them available to families of victims who had traveled into town. Volunteers lined up to donate blood, even after officials announced that no more blood was needed, because so few of those critically injured would survive. Inside the restaurant, once the bodies had been removed, police reopened the curtains. The scene remained horrifying. Investigators began the painstaking process of documenting everything. Not just the victims, but every chair, every table, every utensil, every piece of shattered glass. Nothing was moved without being recorded. The blue pickup truck still sat inside the building, lodged where it had crashed through the glass. Once documentation was complete, authorities carefully reversed it out the same way it had entered, leaving behind deep scars in the structure and far deeper ones in the community. In the days that followed, the town came together to mourn. Newspapers were filled with photographs of the victims, stories of their lives. Parents, grandparents, workers, friends made the loss painfully real. At a press conference, officials answered questions as best they could. Some survivors listening felt a haunting sense of déjà vu. They said their first thought had been of another tragedy, the McDonald's massacre years earlier. It felt impossible that something so similar could happen again. Across the country, people struggled to understand how something as ordinary as lunch could turn so deadly. At the time, mass shootings were not yet part of everyday conversation. There were no easy explanations, and at the center of it all, one question remained. Why? George Joe Hennard was 35 years old at the time of the massacre. He lived alone in a trailer in Belton, Texas, about 20 miles from Keeley. To most people who knew of him, he was an unsettling presence, rude, angry, withdrawn. Neighbors described him as a deeply troubled man. They said he kept to himself, rarely interacting with others, yet constantly acted as though the world was against him. He didn't have close friends. He didn't seem connected to anyone. Police had been called to his neighborhood before. Neighbors reported hearing him yelling in the middle of the night, sometimes shouting at no one in particular. Others believed he was experiencing mental health crises. What stood out most, though, was his behavior toward women. Several neighbors recalled him shouting insults at women as they passed by. One woman said he acted like he knew her, even though she had never spoken to him. He cursed at her, yelling, "Just keep pushing," over and over, filled with rage. A former roommate later described Hennard as hostile and deeply resentful. He frequently referred to women as snakes and made crude, hateful remarks, especially after arguments with his mother. That bitterness would later echo through the restaurant, as survivors reported hearing him target women during the attack, stepping over men to execute women at close range. Hennard had once worked as a merchant marine, but he was fired for drug use and poor performance. After losing his job, his isolation worsened. He spent much of his time writing angry letters, stockpiling weapons, and obsessing over the belief that women and minorities were ruining America. Months before the attack, Hennard mailed disturbing letters to 2 local women. The letters were long, aggressive, and filled with resentment. He enclosed photographs of himself and listed an address in Nevada, where he was temporarily living. He suggested meeting them. The women barely knew him, but the letters made one thing clear. His hatred ran deep. George Hennard legally purchased the 2 firearms he used in the attack. There was nothing outwardly unusual about the purchases. No alarms were triggered. No warnings were issued. To the system, he appeared to be just another customer. On the morning of October 16th, 1991, just hours before the massacre, Hennard was seen at a local convenience store. He bought a few snacks, only a few dollars worth, and told the clerk he would come back later to pay for the rest. It was an ordinary interaction. Unremarkable. Forgettable. Not long after that, he visited the same Luby's Cafeteria where the shooting would later take place. He sat alone. He ate quietly. He didn't cause a scene. He didn't speak to anyone. When he left, no one thought twice about it. But later, witnesses would say something about him seemed off. There was an uneasiness they couldn't quite explain. That visit wasn't random. Hours later, Hennard returned, this time in his pickup truck, armed, focused, and carrying years of resentment with him. Whatever had been building inside him had reached its breaking point. After the massacre, investigators searched for answers. They looked through his belongings. They examined his writings. They spoke to those who had crossed his path. But his true motive remained unclear. What they did find was a history of drug use, isolation, and escalating hostility toward women. Those patterns offered context, but not clarity. With Henrad dead, there would be no trial, no courtroom testimony, no chance for victims' families to confront him. There would be no direct answers from the person who caused so much pain. 3 days after the shooting, Kitty Davis, who had been shot multiple times and lost 3 fingers, died from her injuries. She had been placed into a medically induced coma, but never regained consciousness. Her death raised the toll to 23 victims, 24 if the gunman himself was included. Some survivors suffered injuries that weren't immediately visible. Maria Scherna, who had hidden in the walk-in refrigerator, wasn't shot at all. Instead, she was treated for exposure after spending nearly 3 hours inside, too afraid to come out. 17-year-old Mark Matthews, who had hidden inside the industrial dishwasher, stayed there for nearly 20 hours. He was found the next morning, long after the scene had been cleared, still believing the gunman might be nearby. For many, survival came down 2 seconds, or inches. In the weeks and months after the massacre, survivors struggled to make sense of what they had lived through. Many replayed those 12 minutes again and again in their minds, wondering how they survived, and why others did not. Some remembered how close the gunman had come. One survivor recalled feeling the heat of a bullet pass by. Another remembered a shell casing landing in their hand. The shooter was only an arm as cell-length wide, yet he moved on. For many, survival felt random. But survival did not mean peace. Loud noises triggered panic. Crowded rooms became unbearable. Even something as simple as sitting down for lunch could bring back flashes of terror. Many survivors were later diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Some struggled with survivor's guilt for years, haunted by the question of why they lived when so many others didn't. One survivor, Susana Gracia Hub, turned her grief into action. She had lost both her parents that day. In the aftermath, she became one of the most vocal advocates for changes to self-defense laws in Texas. At the time of the shooting, Texas law made it illegal to carry a concealed handgun. Susanna herself had owned a revolver, but had left it in her car to comply with the law. Many survivors believe that if even one person inside the restaurant had been legally armed, the outcome could have been different. Susanna later entered public office, becoming a Texas state representative. For years, she pushed for stronger self-defense rights, using her own experience as a survivor to argue for change. Her efforts did not happen in isolation. Over the following decade, a series of mass shootings across the country added pressure to the national conversation. Incidents in other states reinforced the same questions about public safety, personal defense, and the limits of prevention. Gradually, laws began to change. By the early 2000s, every U.S. state had enacted some form of concealed carry legislation. Texas, in particular, would go on to have some of the least restrictive gun laws in the country. For supporters, these changes represented empowerment. For others, they raised new concerns. But one thing was clear. The massacre at Luby's had permanently altered the conversation. It was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a turning point. As debates unfolded far beyond Kylene, the local community focused on something far more immediate: healing. In the days after the massacre, a memorial trust fund was established to support the families of the victims. Luby's Cafeteria made the first donation, contributing $10,000 to help begin the long process of recovery. The company also covered funeral expenses for each victim, lifting at least one burden from grieving families. But no amount of money could repair what had been lost. Funerals were held one after another. Churches filled with quiet sobs and whispered prayers. Families leaned on one another, sharing stories of parents, grandparents, co-workers, and friends whose lives had been taken in a place that was supposed to feel safe. For survivors, the physical injuries healed faster than the emotional ones. Some never returned to restaurants. Others avoided public spaces entirely. Flashbacks arrived without warning. The sound of breaking glass, a slammed door, even laughter could suddenly transport them back to that dining room floor. Support groups formed. Counseling became a lifeline. Slowly, people began learning how to live again, even if life would never feel the same. 5 months after the tragedy, the Luby's Cafeteria reopened. The decision was not easy, but it was made with overwhelming community support. Of the 43 employees working that day, 40 returned. Walking back through those doors was painful, but for some, it was also a form of defiance, a refusal to let violence claim everything. The restaurant continued operating for nearly a decade. On September 9th, 2000, Luby's permanently closed its doors. Years later, the building where so many lives were lost was converted into a Chinese buffet restaurant. To passing strangers, it looked ordinary. To the community, it would always carry memory. Before Luby's, many Americans believed mass violence happened somewhere else, in distant cities and dangerous neighborhoods. This massacre shattered that illusion. It showed that violence could strike anywhere, even in a quiet town, even on an ordinary afternoon, even during lunch. Before the massacre at Luby's, mass shootings were not yet woven into the daily consciousness of America. They were seen as rare, unthinkable, isolated, events that belonged to history books, not everyday life. That changed on October 16th, 1990. For a time, the Luby's shooting held the grim distinction of being the deadliest mass shooting in American history. It surpassed the University of Texas Tower shooting in 1980. It surpassed the McDonald's massacre in San Isidro in 1980. And yet, tragically, it would not remain the worst. In the years that followed, the country would witness one mass shooting after another. The locations varied: workplaces, places of worship, shopping centers, and eventually, schools. Each new tragedy pushed the boundaries of what had once seemed impossible. Luby's was not the first, but because it was the worst of its time, it forced the nation to confront a disturbing new reality. Violence was no longer confined to so-called dangerous places. It could erupt anywhere, in small towns, in familiar spaces, on ordinary days. As the years passed, the massacre became a reference point, a moment when the illusion of safety shattered. By the middle of 2025, the Luby's shooting ranked among the most deadly mass shootings in modern U.S. history. No longer the worst, but never forgotten. For the families and survivors, rankings meant nothing. What mattered were the empty chairs at family tables, the voices that would never be heard again, the moments frozen forever in memory. Some survivors chose to speak publicly. Others withdrew into private lives shaped by trauma. Each carried the weight differently, but none escaped it entirely. The building changed. The laws changed. The conversations changed. But the impact of those 12 minutes remained. In the end, what remains are not statistics, not rankings, not headlines. What remains are names. Parents who never came home. Grandparents whose chairs stayed empty. Friends whose laughter ended in a place meant for comfort and routine. The Luby massacre was not just a moment of violence. It was a moment that forced a nation to look at itself, to question assumptions about safety, about randomness, about how fragile ordinary life can be. For the survivors, time did not erase the memories. It reshaped them. Some learned how to live alongside the trauma. Others carried it quietly, unseen. Anniversaries came and went, each one reopening wounds that never fully healed. But there was also resilience, a determination to keep going, to remember, to honor those who were lost. The community of Killeen would never be the same. Neither would the families who gathered every year to mourn, to reflect, to say their names out loud so they would not fade into silence. And for the country, Luby became part of a growing pattern, a warning written early into a story that would continue to unfold in painful ways. A reminder that violence does not announce itself, that it can arrive without warning, on an ordinary afternoon, in an ordinary place. Remembering Luby's is not about fear. It is about awareness, about empathy, about honoring lives by refusing to let them be reduced to numbers. Because behind every tragedy are people. People who loved, who were loved, and who deserve to grow old. As we look back on what happened inside that restaurant, we carry a responsibility to remember, to speak the names, and to recognize the human costs behind every headline. If telling this story keeps even one life from being forgotten, then it matters. And that is why we remember Luby's.